"Let my father go, and the Virgin Mary will make you walk again." The thin voice of a 7-year-old girl cut through the courtroom like lightning. For a moment, the entire room froze. Then the laughter began. It spread across the courtroom like a wave. Lawyers chuckled. Spectators whispered. Even a few reporters exchanged amused glances. They laughed at the little girl's light blue dress, at her worn shoes, and at the absurd idea that a child could challenge the most feared judge in Texas. But Judge Michael Harrison did not laugh. Not because he believed her words, but because, for the first time in 15 years, he hesitated. And that hesitation would change everything. This is a story about faith, justice, and the mysterious power that only the innocence of a child can awaken. A story that forever changed the lives of everyone present on that extraordinary day. But before we continue, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is in your city right now. I'd love to see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary are reaching. On that gray morning in Texas, the courtroom felt heavy, almost like a cathedral of despair. At the center sat Judge Michael Harrison, motionless in his wheelchair. His expression was cold, his gaze sharp as steel. People called him the Iron Judge. In his courtroom, no one dared laugh. No one dared argue too much. No one expected mercy. But it had not always been that way. 15 years earlier, Michael Harrison had been a different man. He ran marathons. He played basketball with friends. He believed justice could exist alongside compassion. Until the night, everything changed. It was raining heavily when his car lost control on the highway. The accident nearly killed him. He survived, but he lost the movement in his legs forever. And little by little, he lost something else as well. His soul. His wife, Sarah, tried to stay by his side. For 2 years she endured the silence, the bitterness, the anger that slowly consumed the man she once loved. But the husband she remembered had disappeared. The accident had not only paralyzed Michael's body, it had hardened his heart. In 2011, the divorce was finalized. Sarah moved to another state, and with her went the last traces of Michael Harrison's humanity. After that, he lived alone in a sterile apartment. There were no family photos, no memories, only stacks of law books and a strict routine. Work, silence, judgment. In 15 years on the bench, Michael Harrison had sentenced more than 1,000 defendants. His rate of maximum sentences? 89%. For him, the law was simple, cold, absolute. Emotions had no place in his courtroom. Mitigating circumstances did not matter. Excuses meant nothing. The staff respected him, but they also feared him. Experienced attorneys did everything possible to avoid having their cases assigned to his court. Families of defendants often began crying the moment they heard his name. Michael Harrison had built a fortress of ice around his heart, and nothing, no argument, no plea, no human story had ever managed to break through it. But far from that courtroom, in a quiet Texas town, lived a family whose lives were about to cross his path and change everything. Robert Thompson, 45 years old, had worked as a gardener for more than 2 decades. He was a quiet man with strong hands hardened by years of labor under the sun. Every morning, he left home before dawn. Every evening, he returned just as the sun disappeared behind the horizon. 3 years earlier, he had lost his wife, Linda. Since then, he had raised their daughter Emma alone. Emma was 7 years old. She had dark eyes that seemed older than her age. Since her mother's death, she and her father had become inseparable. Their small home was filled with children's drawings taped to the walls and family photos on the refrigerator. In Emma's bedroom, on a small shelf beside her bed, stood a small statue of the Virgin Mary. It had belonged to her mother. Before she passed away, Linda had made Robert promise one thing: raise our daughter in faith. And he had kept that promise. Every night Emma knelt beside her bed. The rosary her mother once used slipped through her tiny fingers. She prayed for her father, for the people she loved, and for anyone in the world who might be suffering. To Emma, the Virgin Mary was not just a statue. She was a loving mother who listened. Life was not easy for them, but their home was filled with something many richer families lacked: love. Robert worked hard to provide for them, but he never neglected what mattered most: time, attention, affection. The community respected him deeply. Everyone knew Robert Thompson as an honest man, a hard-working neighbor, someone who would always stop to help if anyone needed it. Emma was loved by everyone as well. At school, teachers praised her kindness. She was one of the best students in her class, but she never bragged. Instead, she helped classmates who struggled with their lessons. Always smiling, always encouraging others. They were a simple family, but they were rich in character, rich in faith, rich in hope. Then, in December of 2022, their peaceful life was shattered. It was a cold morning. Robert was in the backyard preparing his gardening tools for another day of work. Two police cars suddenly stopped in front of the house. Emma, who was getting ready for school, ran to the window. A tall detective stepped out. "Robert Thompson?" he asked. "Yes," Robert replied. "You are under arrest for the jewelry store robbery that occurred on the night of December 15th. You have the right to remain silent." Robert froze. "Robbery," he whispered. He had never stolen anything in his life, not even as a child. "There must be some mistake," he said. "I didn't do this." The detective snapped the handcuffs around his wrists. "Tell that to the judge." Emma ran to the door crying, "Daddy." Robert forced a smile. "It's going to be okay, princess. Daddy didn't do anything wrong." But nothing would be okay for a long time. As the police cars drove away, Mrs. Williams, the elderly neighbor next door, held Emma in her arms while the little girl sobbed uncontrollably. Later that day, the accusations became clear. A jewelry store had been robbed days earlier. Security cameras showed a man who resembled Robert. Witnesses said they had seen someone matching his description near the store that night. Cell phone records placed his phone close to the scene. And during a police search, officers claimed they found one of the stolen jewels in the trunk of his truck. To an outsider, the case seemed airtight. To those who knew him, it was impossible. Robert Thompson was not a thief. He had always taught his daughter that it was better to endure hardship than to take what did not belong to you. His case was assigned to James Mitchell, a public defender. Mitchell was a capable lawyer, but he was overwhelmed with work. Dozens of files piled on his desk every week. When he visited Robert in prison, he found a man completely broken. "I swear on my wife's memory," Robert said, his voice shaking. "I didn't do this. My daughter has already lost her mother. She can't lose her father too." Mitchell believed him, but belief was not enough. Proving innocence was far harder than proving guilt, especially when the evidence looked perfect. And there was one final problem. The case would be judged by Michael Harrison, the Iron Judge, the man who never showed mercy. While Robert waited in jail before trial, Emma lived through a nightmare. Mrs. Williams took her in temporarily, but every night the little girl cried for her father. At school she could barely concentrate. Teachers tried to comfort her. Nothing helped. Each evening she knelt beside the borrowed bed and held her mother's rosary. "Virgin Mary," she whispered through tears, "you know my daddy didn't do this. Please help people see the truth." She didn't only pray for her father. She prayed for the judge too, even though she had never met him. "Virgin Mary, if the judge's heart is closed, please open it. If he is sad, comfort him. If he cannot see the truth, please show him." Meanwhile, defense attorney James Mitchell fought desperately. He questioned the evidence. He searched for inconsistencies. He tried to delay the trial. But the prosecutor was David Chun, a man famous for his relentless pursuit of convictions. Chun treated every trial like a personal battle. To him, truth was secondary. Victory was everything. On the night before the trial, Emma could not sleep. She spent hours praying beside the bed, her voice trembling, her small hands gripping the rosary tightly. Even Mrs. Williams felt shaken watching her. "My dear," the old woman said softly, "you need to rest." Emma looked up with serious eyes. "Do you believe in miracles?" Mrs. Williams hesitated. Then she nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. I believe the Virgin Mary can perform miracles." Emma smiled faintly. "Then I will ask for one." She closed her eyes and whispered a silent promise. "Virgin Mary, if you save my daddy, I will spend my whole life telling people about your love." The next morning, the courtroom was unusually crowded. News about the gardener accused of robbing a jewelry store had attracted local media. Journalists filled the back rows. Cameras waited quietly. Everyone expected another conviction from the famous Iron Judge. Emma arrived holding Mrs. Williams's hand. She wore her best dress, a soft light blue color, like the mantle of the Virgin Mary. And that was when the moment happened. The moment that would stop the courtroom cold and begin a miracle no one there would ever forget. Inside her small school backpack, Emma carried two things that meant everything to her: her mother's rosary and a small image of the Virgin Mary. When she saw her father being escorted into the courtroom by two guards, Emma instinctively tried to run toward him, but Mrs. Williams gently held her back. Robert turned his head and looked at his daughter. He forced a soft smile. He wanted her to see strength. But inside, he felt completely shattered. A moment later, the courtroom doors opened again. Judge Michael Harrison entered in his wheelchair. His expression was the same one everyone recognized. Cold, calculated, emotionless. His eyes scanned the crowded courtroom without stopping on anyone for long. To him, this was just another case. Another morning. Another verdict. But when his gaze briefly passed over Emma, something unexpected happened. For a fraction of a second, something tightened inside his chest. He couldn't explain it. The little girl was looking directly at him. Not with fear, not with anger, but with something that looked like hope. And that unsettled him. The trial began. Prosecutor David Chun presented the case with ruthless precision. The evidence appeared overwhelming. Security camera footage showing a man who looked like Robert. Witnesses who claimed they had seen him near the jewelry store that night. Cell phone data placing him in the area. And most damaging of all, the stolen jewel found in the trunk of his truck. Chin spoke confidently, moving across the courtroom like a man who already knew the outcome. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said dramatically, "the evidence is undeniable. Robert Thompson committed this robbery, and justice demands that he pay the full price." When the prosecutor finished, a heavy certainty filled the room. It seemed impossible that Robert would escape conviction. Defense attorney James Mitchell stood slowly. He did everything he could. He questioned the clarity of the security footage. He challenged the reliability of witness testimony. He raised doubts about how the jewel could have appeared in Robert's truck. He presented character witnesses who spoke about Robert's honesty and reputation in the community. He reminded the jury that Robert had never been arrested before. But the defense sounded fragile against the mountain of evidence presented by the prosecution. Mitchell could feel the case slipping away. And when he glanced toward Judge Harrison, he saw the same icy expression. There would be no mercy here. Then the most important moment arrived. The closing statements had been made. Now came the sentencing. Prosecutor Chun delivered his final argument with the confidence of someone who had already won. Mitchell attempted one last emotional appeal. He spoke about Emma, about a broken family, about the responsibility of the court to be absolutely certain before taking a father away from his daughter. But his words seemed to dissolve into the cold air of the courtroom. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses. He picked up the papers in front of him, and his voice sliced through the silence like a blade. "Robert Thompson, after careful analysis of the evidence presented, this court finds." Wait. The voice was small, but it echoed through the courtroom like thunder. Every head turned. Emma Thompson had stood up. She stepped away from the bench where she had been sitting quietly. Mrs. Williams tried to stop her, but the little girl was already walking toward the center of the courtroom with small, determined steps. A murmur spread through the crowd. Judge Harrison frowned. Interruptions during sentencing were unheard of. Emma stopped just below the judge's platform. She looked tiny standing there, but her eyes were fearless. Even at 7 years old, she understood she was confronting the most powerful person in the room. "I'm Robert Thompson's daughter," she said clearly, "and I need to speak before you make a terrible mistake." Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly. His eyes narrowed. "Child," he said coldly, "this is a court of law, not a place for. I know what justice is." Emma's voice cut him off. The entire courtroom gasped. A 7-year-old girl had just interrupted the most feared judge in Texas. "My mother taught me before she went to heaven," Emma continued. "Justice is when the truth comes out, even when it's hidden." For several long seconds, Michael Harrison said nothing. There was something about the girl's courage that disturbed him. It was a kind of pure bravery he had not seen in years. Finally, he spoke. "You have 1 minute." He said it not out of kindness, but curiosity. Emma took a deep breath. Then she did something no one in that courtroom would ever forget. She opened her backpack. From inside, she carefully removed her mother's rosary. The beads were worn with time, but they still shone with the faith of generations. She held the rosary tightly in her small hands and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," she said softly but firmly, "my daddy didn't do what they say he did, and the Virgin Mary will prove it." Laughter erupted across the courtroom. At first quiet, then louder. Some people whispered sarcastic comments. Even Prosecutor Chin smiled with open contempt. "Poor child," someone muttered. "She's completely desperate." But Emma did not react. She raised her voice above the noise. "If you let my daddy go, the Virgin Mary will make you walk again." The courtroom exploded. Cruel laughter bounced off the marble walls. Mocking applause. Sarcastic comments. "She's lost her mind. How ridiculous. Someone remove this child." Judge Harrison slammed the gavel repeatedly. "Order. Order in this court." But even he looked shaken. Emma did not move, still holding the rosary, still standing there in her blue dress. Then she slowly knelt down in the middle of the courtroom, right there on the cold floor, in front of hundreds of people. And she began to pray. "Hail Mary, full of grace." Her voice cut through the laughter like a blade of light. Some people laughed louder, but others began to fall silent. Something about the moment felt different. "Blessed art thou among women." Emma continued praying, tears streaming down her cheeks. Yet her voice remained strong. It was a scene that even hardened hearts could not easily ignore. A child kneeling in a courtroom, begging for justice. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen." And in that exact moment, something impossible began to happen. While Emma prayed, ignoring the mockery around her, Judge Michael Harrison felt something he had not experienced in 15 years. At first, it was only a faint tingling in his right leg, so subtle he almost dismissed it. Perhaps imagination, perhaps emotion triggered by the strange scene unfolding before him. But the sensation grew stronger, warm, alive. It traveled slowly up his calf like small waves of electricity, a sensation he had not felt since the accident. Michael gripped the arms of his wheelchair. His knuckles turned white. "This isn't possible," he thought. "It's psychological, just suggestion." But the sensation intensified. It felt as if something inside his body was waking up after years of silence. Dead nerves pulsing again, forgotten muscles receiving impossible signals. Emma finished her first Hail Mary. Then she began another. "Hail Mary, full of grace." Michael tried something he had not attempted in years. He tried to move his toes. For a single, terrifying second, he felt them respond. Only slightly, but it was real. 15 years of complete paralysis. And now this. His breathing became heavy. Cold sweat rolled down his forehead. Around him the courtroom was still noisy and chaotic. But he no longer heard any of it. All he could hear was the little girl praying, "Blessed art thou among women." The sensation in his legs grew stronger, like electric current running through nerves long believed dead. Michael tightened his grip on the wheelchair. He forced his face to remain expressionless. But inside he was in panic. This cannot be happening. Spinal injuries are irreversible. The doctors were clear. Emma continued praying, now on her third Hail Mary. Her voice carried an unwavering faith, a faith so pure it felt almost tangible, as if the courtroom itself had become charged with something unseen. And the miracle had only just begun. And then, it happened. Not a vague sensation, not a passing tingling, not a trick of the mind. For approximately 5 eternal seconds, Judge Michael Harrison felt his legs completely. Not just awareness, control. His muscles obeyed. His feet pressed down against the footrest of the wheelchair. For 5 miraculous seconds, the man who had lived in paralysis for 15 years felt life surging again through his legs. Michael let out a strangled cry and bent forward in the chair, both hands trembling uncontrollably. The courtroom stopped. The laughter died instantly. A silence fell so suddenly it felt violent. Every eye turned toward the most feared judge in Texas. "Your Honor," the court clerk asked, alarmed. Emma stopped praying and looked up at him with her wide eyes, still full of hope. Michael tried to regain control of his expression, but his hands would not stop shaking. The sensation had vanished, but the memory of those 5 seconds burned through every fiber of his being. With a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he said, "This session is adjourned indefinitely." The gavel slipped from his hand. 3 hours later, Michael Harrison sat in the office of the neurologist who had followed his condition for the past 15 years. "I need new tests," Michael said immediately. "Now." The doctor looked at him with confusion. "Michael, you had complete neurological testing only 6 months ago. Everything was stable. Nothing had changed." "No," Michael interrupted sharply, slamming his fist on the desk. "Something happened today." The doctor frowned. "What do you mean?" Michael leaned forward. "For a few seconds, I felt my legs." The doctor studied him carefully. "It could be stress," he said cautiously. "Sometimes the brain creates sensations. It wasn't imagination, Michael cut in, his voice firm and cold. I moved my feet. I felt my toes pressing against the chair. For the first time, the neurologist looked unsettled. After a moment, he reached for his schedule. All right, he said. MRI tomorrow morning. We'll look again. Michael left the office more shaken than before. For 15 years, medicine had told him the same thing. Permanent damage. No recovery. No hope. And yet now, after the prayer of a 7-year-old girl in a blue dress, his body had done something impossible. While Michael wrestled with the mystery of what had happened inside him, someone else in the legal system had begun to question Robert Thompson's case. An investigator assigned to review details from the interrupted trial sat late into the evening re-examining the file. How could a man like Robert Thompson, a gardener with no criminal record, respected by his community, have committed a violent robbery? The more she looked, the less it made sense. The security footage was poor. The suspect looked like Robert, but not clearly enough for certainty. Robert had worked in 3 nearby homes during the same week, which meant he had a legitimate reason to be in that part of town. Then came the discovery that changed everything. A man named Mark Stevens, recently released on bail just 2 days before the robbery, looked strikingly similar to Robert Thompson. That fact alone was disturbing, but what came next was worse. The investigator obtained permission to re-examine Robert's truck. There, she found something the original report had barely mentioned. The trunk lock had been forced. Someone had tampered with it. Someone had placed that jewel there afterward. She followed the chain of evidence, tracing who had access to the case materials. And eventually the path led to one person. A young assistant working under Prosecutor David Chun. A man drowning in debt. A childhood friend of Mark Stevens. And desperate to prove himself. When confronted, he collapsed almost immediately. I just wanted to help Mark, he said through tears. I thought no one would ever find out. He admitted everything. He had planted the jewel, altered paperwork, manipulated the evidence. The prosecutor himself had never known. He, too, had been deceived. The written confession was delivered directly to Judge Michael Harrison. Meanwhile, Michael was at the hospital undergoing a full battery of neurological tests. Hours later, Dr. Foster stood before a screen, staring at the results with visible disbelief. These findings are extraordinary, he said quietly. Michael's heart pounded. What does that mean? Dr. Foster hesitated. Your spinal injury is still there, he said. But there is activity we have never seen before. Michael gripped the edge of the chair. What kind of activity? Your nerves are showing signs of regeneration. Michael stared at him. What? It's very slight, Dr. Foster continued, still sounding stunned. But detectable. There is real neurological response where there was none before. Michael struggled to breathe evenly. Is it possible, he asked, that I could walk again? The doctor paused. It's too early to promise anything, he said honestly. But for the first time in 15 years, there is a real possibility. Michael left the hospital with a feeling he had not allowed himself in decades. Hope. And it terrified him. When the trial resumed, the courtroom was fuller than ever. Word had spread. The interruption. The little girl. The judge's sudden collapse. Something had happened that no one could explain. Now, everyone wanted to see how it would end. The investigator presented the new evidence in full. The confession. The forged records. The proof that the jewel had been planted in Robert's truck. There was no room left for doubt. At the front of the courtroom, Michael Harrison sat in his wheelchair, his face unreadable, but something inside him had shifted forever. He looked down at the papers before him, then up at Robert Thompson, and finally at Emma, the child who had knelt on the courtroom floor and prayed when everyone laughed. Michael spoke. His voice was still firm, but no longer cold. After a complete review of the evidence, he said, "This court declares Robert Thompson innocent of all charges." He paused. "Mr. Thompson, you are free to go." For a moment, no one moved. Then Emma ran, straight into her father's arms. "Daddy," she cried. Robert dropped to his knees and held her so tightly it was as if he could stop time itself. "I knew everything would be okay," Emma whispered. Michael watched them from the bench. Still seated, still processing the impossible. But for the first time in 15 years, something within him no longer felt dead. 3 months later, people across Texas were whispering that the Iron Judge had changed. He still believed in justice. But now he also listened. Now he weighed mercy alongside law. Something in him had softened. and the sensations in his legs continued. Month after month, the medical tests showed more improvement. It is a unique case, Dr. Foster admitted. I have no medical explanation for it, but your nerves are regenerating. And then, 6 months later, on an ordinary Thursday morning, something happened. Michael woke with a strange awareness in his body. This time, it wasn't a fleeting tingling. It was control. At breakfast, he tried moving his toes. They responded. Completely. His breathing became shallow. Slowly, gripping the edge of the table, he pushed himself upward. For the first time in 15 years, his legs held him. He stood, weak, shaking, but standing. He took one step, then another, then another. Judge Michael Harrison was walking. 2 hours later, he stood at the Thompson family's door, leaning on a cane. When Robert opened the door and saw him there, truly standing, he could not speak. Emma. Robert called into the house. Come here. Emma came running. She stopped when she saw Michael standing in the doorway. Then she smiled the brightest smile he had ever seen. Mr. Michael, she said softly. That's wonderful. She hugged him without hesitation. Michael's eyes filled with tears. Emma, he whispered, deeply moved. Thank you for helping me find my heart again. Emma looked up at him with the calm wisdom that had startled so many adults before. You did that yourself, she said gently. You just needed to remember it was still there. And that is how a 7-year-old girl changed the destiny of a judge and the lives of everyone who witnessed that day. Because what happened in that courtroom cannot be explained only by law or medicine or reason. It was a miracle of the Virgin Mary, born from the pure faith of a child who dared to believe when everyone else laughed. And perhaps that is the deepest mystery of all, that miracles happen when someone kneels with their whole heart, even if the world doubts. May the same love of the Virgin Mary that restored hope to Michael Harrison also reach your life. May she touch the pain no one sees, heal the wounds no one understands, and restore what once seemed lost forever. Because the miracles of the Virgin Mary still happen, and the next one may happen to you. If this story strengthened your faith, subscribe now to the channel to continue following testimonies and miracles of the Virgin Mary. And in the comments, write with faith, Virgin Mary, intercede for us, so that together we may form a great chain of prayer and hope.